Okay, today's daf we're going to be learning is Pesachim daf mem. Today's daf is sponsored by Mona Fishbane in memory of her beloved mother-in-law, Bernice Fishbane, Nana Zichrona Levacha, whose 14th year at site we recently observed. Nana was a lifelong learner who continues to inspire me. And by Hannah and Michael Petrakowski to Anne Schiff. Anne introduced us to Hadran's daf yomi, so she deserves the merit of our learning, acknowledging with gratitude. Okay, we're going to start. I'll just remind everyone, last day of the year, so if you want to get in any last minute donations to Hadran, it's a good day to finish that up. If you want to join our circle of friends or any other type of donation is welcome. Okay, we're going to start now with the bottom of Lamed Tet Amud Bet. Basically today's daf is all about advice or ideas about things that could possibly lead to something leavening. Now, something that I read in this book that I've made reference to here and there, Mishnat Eretz Yisrael by Safrai. It's a book about an academic approach to the Mishnayot. And he talks there about something that maybe we just, it didn't dawn on me, but it's very obvious that in those days, we don't generally keep flour over Pesach, right? Even you don't really have to sell your flour, but you also keep it. If you keep it in your freezer or in your cabinet, it's far back with all your chametz stuff, or again, if you don't sell chametz still, you put it away with your kitniot that you don't have to sell, but you can't have those accessible on Pesach. But in those days, they made their matzah on Pesach. So they obviously had flour around in their houses on Pesach. And therefore, when we look at this sugya, you can understand why they're discussing all sorts of things that one might do with flour. And then the question becomes, does one have to be concerned that it will become leavened? And the whole issue, we have all sorts of things that stop things from leavening. Baking, cooking, all those things stop the leavening process, right? At that point, it can't cook it, right? Once you cook it, it can't leaven anymore. Or we're going to learn vinegar. We saw that yesterday. The vinegar is very strong for preventing leavening. So we're going to see that today. And we're going to talk about all different things that can one do or can one not do with flour on Pesach. There's a difference also between flour they had toasted flour, which is different because already it went through a process. So once it's processed, it's also not likely to leaven. But then there will be a question, maybe if we allow that, we'll see this toward the end of the daf, maybe people will confuse it with regular flour and think you could use regular flour. And then maybe we'll get into, again, depends who the person is. Before we can start, I really want to say one other thing that clearly permeates this page, which is people changing their minds about their opinions, which is very interesting, right? Nowadays, you wish that politicians were a little more open to listening to other people and maybe potentially changing their minds. And unfortunately, that doesn't happen enough in nowadays. But in the Gemara, you're going to see that there's a number of situations, particularly in today's daf, where people think something at first. Again, this is all a matter of, do we have to be concerned? Are people going to mess up or not? Will it become leavened? Will it not? Where they're not 100% sure. And then someone kind of mentioned something and then they change their mind about it. So it's interesting to see how people are open-minded about these things and are willing to change their mind. And it really comes up a number of times. I didn't count how many, but maybe by the end of daf, we'll try to pay attention to how many times this happens in today's daf. So let's start from the bottom of Lamed Tet Amud Bet. 3 lines from the bottom. From 2 lines from the bottom. Amar Mar Zutra. Mar Zutra says, Lo limache inish kidra bekimcha da'avishuna, dilma lo bashel shapir va'ate lidei chimutz. Okay, what exactly this is? Rashi says this is when you thicken a batter. Like you want to thicken a soup and you make a French onion soup and I add flour to it to make it thicker, right? So you can't thicken anything, even though theoretically, now what does he say? With kimcha da'avishuna. Kimcha da'avishuna is that toasted or roasted flour. So it's already gone through a process, but he says you still shouldn't do it. Dilma lo bashel shapir va'ate lidei chimutz. It might not be cooked fully, and it might not cook enough, and therefore what will happen? It will still leaven, okay? There's a concern that even though it's been roasted or toasted, it still might come to leaven. Amar Rav Yosef. Rav Yosef also suggests, Lo lichlit inish trei chite bahade hadade. Don't try to to toast or roast or somehow putting a fire, right, to singe. I guess the singe would be a better word. Don't singe 2 stalks of wheat or 2 kernels of wheat next to 2 kernels, actually, not the stalks. 2 kernels of wheat next to each other. Why, right? This is like, let's say you're roasting them. So, or toasting them. What will happen? Dilma az lechada v'yat v'bitziria de chaverta. Oh, sorry, my mistake. This is lichlot. I got confused by the terminology. Lichlot is to boil it in water. Right now we're talking about boiling. Okay, there's a lot of procedures we're going to discuss today, so it's a little bit confusing. Chalita, we learned before, that's when you throw it into boiling water. So don't put 2 kernels of wheat into boiling water together, because what is unique about wheat, it has a crack in the middle. What might happen? Dilma az lachada v'yat v'bitziria de chaverta. The 2 kernels, one will go and sit in the crack of the other. And what will happen? The whole idea is if you boil them in water, remember the boiling process stops it from leavening. But if there's one blocking the other and the water can't get into all the 4 sides of this kernel of wheat, then it won't stop it from leavening and it might leaven. So because of that, you can't cook 2, you can't boil 2 together, which obviously makes it hard to what you're going to do them one at a time. I guess you could scald them, right? Throw one in, take it out, throw one in, take it out. It'll take a really long time, depending on how many you need. And it will leaven. Another suggestion. This is the lichroch, the toasting them. Don't toast them or put a fire on them, singe them. Don't singe them 2 bundles of 2 stalks, one next to the other, because in the stalks, what do you have? You have the inner moisture, okay, which is, we're gonna call it in a minute. It's like mei perot, right? The same way, first of all, perot means fruits, but they call these fruits in the Gemara also. We see this all the time, that wheat is called fruit, right? What they mean is any liquid that's inherent inside something, right? That there's liquid in it's moist inside. So what happens when you warm something up? The moisture comes out, and then what will happen? That, and what we're going to call it mei perot, that is going to not dilma nafke maya mehayu bala idach. If you put them on the fire both together or singe them, what will happen? As you warm them up, the liquid will come from one, drop on the other, and it will cause it to leaven. So this is a problem, Abaye says. And it will become leavened. Amar le Rava. Now remember, with matzah ashira, we said it's not a problem because it doesn't, the mei perot don't cause things to leaven. Okay, that was one of the things we discussed then. So Abaye seems to think that they do. So comes Rava and he says, Amar le Rava, ihachi afilu chadanami. First of all, he says, if you're really worried about the water that's inside the wheat, then you can't even use one, because what will happen? Right? From one side of the grain to the other side, what will happen? The water will come out of the kernel and it'll drop down into itself. So basically, it's a problem then also. So you shouldn't just say only 2, even 1 should be a problem. So basically, he disagrees with him on 2 counts, really. Number 1, he thinks that, and so here we're going to see the second count he disagrees with. But the first is, what you're saying doesn't make any sense, because you should say 1 and not 2, because 1, 2, 3, 4, anything should be a problem. He says, I don't even think you have an issue at all. Forget about the fact that, according to you, you should say even 1, but there's really no problem at all because mei perot do not leaven. He thinks that's not an issue. That kind of liquid will not cause leavening to the grain. But now we're going to say, here's the first. Okay, we'll try to keep count. Hadr be Abaye me'ahi. So Abaye changes his mind based on Rava's question. But really, it sounds like Rava made him rethink it, but he doesn't actually agree with Rava. He still thinks that it's going to be a problem, okay, with mei perot or machmitzim. He doesn't disagree with that. But he says there's a separate issue here, which would basically not make this an issue. Dechol agav madalayu lo mechamse. When something falls on something else as it's going on its way down, what generally happens if something falls? Like, there's a difference between soaking something in water and something falling on water. Usually if something falls, it doesn't necessarily get all soaked in. It usually kind of drips down to the ground. Okay, it'll kind of roll off of it. So he basically says, by putting water on it, you're going to end up not necessarily causing it to leaven, and therefore this is not a problem. So if you roast 2 of them together, it doesn't really matter, because even if the water drips from one to the other, it's going to drip right off and it's going down. And now he proves it to Amar Abaye, as he says elsewhere. Hai chatzpa de avishuna. If you have a jug full of this toasted grains. Schifa share, zekifa asur. If it's upside down, and the idea is you're going to basically put fire on it. When you fire it up and get it heated up, any liquid, if it's turned upside down, okay, you have to think about how they're not falling out of there, but it must be maybe they're in stalks, and the stalks are, let's say, I can think of it, the stalks fit exactly into the jug, and therefore nothing's going to fall out. If it's upside down, then again, any liquid that comes out of them will drip down onto the ground. Whereas if it's upright, all the liquid's going to stay in there, and it's going to be a problem. And obviously, he thinks it's a problem because he thinks that mei perot, the liquid that comes from fruits or grains, will cause it to leaven. But obviously, Rava amar afilu zekifa nami share mei perot nenu umei perot enam machmitzim. Rava disagrees and says this is mei perot; they don't cause leavening. This isn't even a problem if it's upright. Okay, so again, you have Rav and Abai, but you notice that Abai switched. First, he thought that taking these two together was a problem because one, the liquid from one would drop on the other. I've had 2 questions on what he said, and in the end, he changes his mind, but not to match Rava. Okay, but he does change his mind about it. Next topic, latita. Okay, ein lotetin seorim bepesach. Latita is they would wash the grains. Okay, it's either they soak it or maybe they just rinse it. They would rinse the grains. Okay, first we're going to talk about barley, then we're going to move to wheat. In order to make it easier to take off the klipa, the peel, right, the bad part, the chaff. So in order to make it separate easily, now we're going to see that what does it mean to make it separate easily? It means also it's going to come off entirely, which means you're going to get a much cleaner flour if you do this. Remember, their whole obsession was with the most clean flour you can get. So, but in order to make that happen, we're going to see, it seems like, although we'll question whether you really have to or not, you have to do this process, or you may have to do this process of latita, of rinsing it. Now, what's the problem? When you rinse it, it's come in contact with water, and this is at an early stage, right, when you're just dealing with the kernel, and then it might cause it to leaven over time. So, ein lotetin seorim bepesach. We saw this yesterday. You can't do this. We brought this in at the end to say, oh, what do you see here that we don't penalize you, right? So one of the opinions was say, therefore, we don't penalize you in another case if you did it anyway. V'im latat, it depends what happens. We go and we see. Im nitbak'u asurot. If they cracked open, right? If the kernel cracked open of the barley, it's a problem. But lo nitbak'u, if nothing happened, didn't open up, then mutarot, then it'll be permitted. Rabbi Yossi omer shoran b'chometz v'chometz tzomtan. It's unclear, different opinions about whether Rabbi Yossi is being more stringent or more lenient. What does he mean? Does he mean, and is he talking about if they opened up or if they didn't crack open? Okay, so some people say he's trying, if it didn't crack open, it's still a problem. So the only thing you could do is put it in vinegar, because vinegar will stop it from leavening. Some people say he's only talking about if they cracked open, because cracking open doesn't mean they leavened yet. It just means they're going to leaven. So even if they cracked open, maybe he's being lenient here and saying there's still a solution. You can soak them in vinegar and that won't be a problem. But he's being strict because he's saying if you don't do that, then it's going to be forbidden, right? Or he's being less strict though than the Tanakama, because the Tanakama says once they crack open, it's for sure a problem. He says no, maybe you can put in vinegar. So there's 2 ways to understand whether he's being more lenient or more stringent. Amar Shmuel, ein alcha ke Rabbi Yossi, but we don't hold like him about soaking it in vinegar. Amar Rav Chisda, Amar Rav Ukva. Now we're going to have to understand, what does it mean nitbak'u? Now we understood nitbak'u means literally it cracked open, but now we're going to see not necessarily. There's 2 opinions about it. The second one is going to say yes, understand the Braita exactly as it says. But Rav Chisda says in the Amar Ukva, lo nitbak'u mamash, even if they didn't exactly crack open, but if you put them over a barrel of wine and the air from the wine kind of gets into it, the aroma from the wine gets into it, in other words, once you've loosened them up and they'll easily crack open, if you were to do something small, like put them on top of a barrel of wine, then that's already considered nitbaku. Okay, so it's in an earlier stage. He would already say it's a problem. Shmuel amar nitbaku mamash. Shmuel says, no. It really means only cracked open. Even if it loosened up a little, we're still not worried it's going to leaven. And not only did he say this, but he even acted upon this. Avet Shmuel uvda bedura debe barchashu nitbaku mamash. There was a case in the village of barchashu, and even though, right, he waited till they were nitbaku mamash. In other words, he held only nitbaku mamash, it would be a problem. Amar Rabba. Now we're moving to a new topic. It's not totally new. It's about latita, but it's latita of the washing of the grains of wheat. And now we're going to see three different opinions about this. So the first is Rabba. Baal nefesh lo yilto. It's going to be one of those cases where we're going to take the same logic and flip it on its head and use the same logic in the reverse. So first he says, Baal nefesh lo yilto. Baal nefesh means someone who wants to be extra careful shouldn't do latita. So the Gemara says, my area Baal nefesh. Why a Baal nefesh? It should be anybody. Didn't we just say, afilu kulei manami, everyone. Daha Tanya, didn't we learn in the Braita, ein lo tatin solim bepesach? And what should be the difference between barley and wheat? Seems like it would be the same. So why did you say it in the terminology of only someone who's extra careful should be careful not to do this, but the average person can do it? So hachi kamar, this is what they explain. There's really a difference between wheat and barley. Okay, and that's why I said we're going to flip the logic, because later we're going to say it's the reverse. Okay, where we're going to say one is more likely to leaven than the other, and then we're going to say the other one is more likely to leaven. Baal nefesh, hachi kamar. Baal nefesh, a careful person, afilu chitim dishrire. Okay, they're tighter, they're harder to penetrate with the water. Even that lo yilto. Okay, so rim, which are much more easily penetratable by water, there for sure it's a problem. Wheat, less likely, but a special, person who wants to be extra careful will be careful and not do it. Amarle Rav Nachman. Here's an interesting, strong reaction by Rav Nachman. Rav Nachman calls Rabba Abba. Some people say it was Rav Nachman's term for him. Some people say it was actually Rabba's name. Man ditzayat le Abba. Whoever listens to Abba, okay, this is a very strong way of saying it. Anyone who listens to him, it's almost like he's cursing them. Achil nahamadi ipusha. You're going to eat moldy bread. Okay, in other words, he's basically saying you're going to eat poor quality bread because Taha bar be Rav Huna latate, ube Rav bar Avin latate. They all did latita. Okay, he's saying here, I'll quote you some ba'alei nefesh, some good, strong, good, solid people, rabbis who did this. And he's basically saying you're going to compromise on the quality of your bread. It's almost like saying you're going to end up with, maybe they thought it was more preserved. Okay, maybe it's lasted longer if it was clean, and therefore, your bread's going to rot. It's going to get moldy very quickly. Like it doesn't have preservatives in it or something. I don't know. Maybe they thought that preserved the bread more, or maybe he's just saying you're going to get punished. If you're going to be so strict, well, God will get you or something and your bread will go bad because look, all these people did it and it's not a problem. So we have on the one hand, Baal Nefesh won't do it. We have it's entirely permitted. And now we're going to have the third, which is Rava Amar Asur Liltot. For everyone, it's forbidden. So now, how do we understand that? Sounds like, now we're going to say the reverse logic. First we said it said So'orim you can, obviously Chitim you can. Now we're going to say, oh no, it says So'orim there. So'orim udelo hachite share, right? And there we explained, Chitim are much harder to leaven. Now we're going to have to explain the reverse logic, okay? So first they say, look, it says you can't do it. It sounds like just barley, which was the conclusion we came to out of the first opinion. So they say lo mebaya kamar. It's what we call a lo mebaya structure, which means I'm telling you the less obvious one. The more obvious one is obviously a problem. Chitim are more obviously a problem. Again, it's the exact reverse logic. Lo mebaya chitim. Why? And now we're going to go back to something we learned at the beginning of the daf. Kevan de'ipet siria ayle behumayet has cracks in it. So because there's a crack in the kernel of the wheat, the water goes right in. But sare de shie ema shapir dami. But the barley, which is smooth, we will assume maybe the water doesn't go in and it's okay. And that's why Kamashma, and I had to tell you, even barley. So they understand that Braita is saying even, not only wheat, but even barley. Okay, there's a picture in the Koran, if you have it, about the difference, because So'orim also have cracks, and the Steinsaltz kind of explains what the difference is between the cracks, that these cracks are penetratable and these are not. Anyway, that's an aside about the nature of barley and wheat. Hadar Amar Rava. But now Rava changes his mind. So again, we have three opinions. Baal Nefesh won't do it. It's entirely permitted or it's entirely forbidden. So now Rava, who had the extreme opinion that it's entirely forbidden, changes his mind. Mutar Liltot. He ends up saying, okay, we're going to see he eventually does a full 360. Right now, he's just saying it's permitted, okay, which you would think is a full 360, but you're going to see we're going to go even farther soon. First, he says it's permitted. How does he know this? Titania. It says in a Braita, Yotzim bepatnikia v'hadra'ah. What can you use for Pesach? We learned this already for Matzah. Very clean, right? A fine flour and a not fine, even if it's full of the bran still, right? The whole wheat. And he says there's no way to have a patnikia without doing latita. That's the only way to get your flour to be fine. And therefore it must be latita's permitted. So he changes his mind. Rav Papa questions Rava now, and he says, what are you talking about? I'll prove to you from a Braita that it doesn't, you can have fine flour even without doing latita. It's an interesting debate because, again, it's about reality. Can you get to a fine flour without it or not? Maybe the issue is also how you define a fine flour. What is the fine flour that they discuss? So anyway, he says, look here. It says, if you take flour or the solet, the finer flour from a Gentile, now the question is here, are they susceptible to impurity? Can you assume, now what's the issue? Can you assume that they came in contact with water? Now, if you assume they did latita, then they came in contact with water. If you assume they didn't do latita, then they're not in contact with water. So now we're going to distinguish between the villagers and the city people. The people who lived in the village didn't do latita because that was more like the rich people did latita, not the poor people. I assume it's a difference, poor or rich. So the people in the villages, it's tehorim. You can assume it never came in contact with water. Shel krachim tmeim. Now, the kfarim my taima. What's the reason? Lav mishum delo latate. Is it not because of that? And notice what the heading of this braita is. Kakarele solet. It says flowers and fine flowers that you got from Gentiles, if they're from the villages, which seems to imply that the villagers, in the villages, they could have made fine flour even without latita. So tirgama akimcha. No, they say that the solet refers to the second part of the people in the cities, not the people in the villages. The villages were only talking about their flowers because they didn't make solet in the villages. Therefore, this is not a problem for Rava. However, what happens is the discussion happened. Rav Papa asked Rava the following question. Rava answered, and Rava leaves the scene. And then after he leaves the scene, right? How many times this happened to you? You're in the middle of a discussion, an argument with someone, and then they walk out, and all of a sudden you think, right? Maybe you're less under pressure, and all of a sudden you realize, oh, I had a much better question. So that's what Rav Papa says. Batar dinafik, after Rava leaves, Amal, he said, oh, my time alo emale mehai. Why didn't I ask him the following question from here? This is a much better proof. And it really is. Ta'amar Rabbi Zera Amarav, Yirmiyah Amar Shmuel, Chitin shel minachot, ein lo titinotam. The wheat from the mincha offerings, the meal offerings, you cannot do latita. Why can't you do latita? Because remember, the mincha could have become chametz. Same idea here. And we all know, we talked about this before, that the mincha was made with the finest solet. It calls it in the Torah solet. V'kakari lahu solet. And it's solet even though it didn't undergo this process of latita. So there you have a perfect proof. You can't start saying that's something else. They were talking about, no, this is clear that you can have solet even without latita. So he didn't get to ask Rava the question, it seems, or at least not at that point. But now we're going to say, Hadar Amar Rava, eventually Rava not only changed his mind, and remember, he started with it's forbidden. He went to it's permitted. Now you think, where else could he go from here? Well, he could go even farther. He now says, mitzvah liltot. It's a mitzvah to do it. Okay, now why is it a mitzvah? We're going to see, okay, he says shene emal because it says ushmartem et hamatzot. And now we're going to talk about shmur matzah. Okay, it says you have to protect the matzah, which basically means you have to watch it. And the assumption is you have to watch it once it came in contact with water to make sure it doesn't leaven. Or maybe you have to also watch it that it doesn't come in contact with water. But here they're viewing it as you have to watch it once it comes in contact with water. It needs to be watched. So now he says like this: "I lo debai latita shimur lamai." If it's not that it came in contact with water, you rinsed it from the early stage, then why do you need to watch it from such an early stage? We're now going to talk about 3 stages. There's the time of latita. Okay, soon we're going to add a 4th, which is from the time it was harvested. Okay, but that's only later. But right now we're going to talk about 3. The time that you rinse it with water. Then the time where you knead the dough, there for sure it gets in contact with water. And then after it's already kneaded, before you bake it. So he's now going to say, okay, so before we even move on, the question is, what's the mitzvah though? It doesn't really say this. So some people say what he means is, since there's a mitzvah to watch it from an early stage, it must be that it comes in contact with water earlier so that, and it's almost like counterintuitive, but get it in touch with water so you can fulfill the mitzvah of watching it and protecting it so that it doesn't leaven. Some people say, no, it's the mitzvah is you want to get the cleanest flour that you can, and therefore you do it. You do latita because it's a mitzvah to have the best matzah that you can. And then once you do that, he's going to prove from the fact that you need to watch it that it must be we did latita. So now, how does he know that the shimur, shimur delisha, maybe it only needs to be watched from the time you need it? I'm already going to preface this by saying this proof is a very weak proof. You'll see in a minute why. Anyway, the Gemara is going to reject it, but right now they're going to try to prove that it can't be that you need shimur only from stage 2. And they were basically going to say because you need shmira before stage 3. That's why it's not going to be the greatest proof, because you really want to prove that you need shmira before stage 2. And it really proves you need shmira before afia. But that's why it's a little weak here. So shimur delisha, lav shimur. That's not enough to watch it just from the time you need it. How do we know? If you take a dough that a Gentile needed, okay, the first we talk about must be that there was a Jew involved somehow. Otherwise, how could this possibly be? But if you take a batzek of nochri, adam mehem, you can eat this on Pesach, even Seder night. But you have to, at least in the end, okay, there's 2 ways to read this, either in the end or at the end. It's a big difference. In the end, meaning at least at some point in the night, you have to be yosei your chiyuv matzah with shmur matzah, okay, and not matzah that wasn't watched because the Gentile needed it. So some people say, Rashi says, no, but achrona means the afikomen. At the end of the night, you have to eat. Why the afikomen? Why is that more important than motzi matzah? Because in the days of the temple, they would eat the korban pesach ala sove. It was eaten at the end of the meal, right? We always eat the matzah and all that at the beginning of the meal. That's because we don't have the korban pesach. Korban pesach was meant to be eaten ala sova at the end of the meal. And therefore, we're talking about the matzah that you would eat with the korban pesach that you would eat at the end of the night. So 2 ways to understand this b'achrona. But in any case, they say b'achrona in, b'rishona lo. What do you see here? In order to be yotzei matzah, it has to be watched. And this matzah from the Gentile wasn't watched. You can't use it in general, right? Only can't use it for your mitzvah. I'm sorry, you can't use it for your mitzvah of matzah. So my taima, what's the reason? It must be mishum delo avabu shimur, because it wasn't watched. So now they say, but why? You got it when it wasn't baked yet. That's why I said this is really proving it from stage 3, not from stage 2 of the lisha. You should have been able to watch it at least from the baking point, and then it would have been okay. You would have at least done watching at some part of the process. So therefore, he says from the fact that you can't just watch part of the process, it teaches you that you must need shimur, and this is where the jump is. It's not so clear. You must need it earlier. If you need it earlier, then it must be in contact with water. Otherwise, why would you need shmirah? And he jumps it 2 stages back, not just saying from before lisha, but before, right, the latita, from the time of latita. So the Gemara rejects this, which is why the fact that this isn't the greatest proof doesn't bother me, because the Gemara says it's in a good proof. There, from the moment it came in contact with water, which is when they needed it, forget, maybe they didn't do latita. Maybe from the time it got in contact with the water when they needed it, there wasn't, right? It wasn't done shimur because it was still in the hands of the Gentile. But maybe if it never came in contact with water until the point of needing, maybe you'd only need to watch it from the time the water came in contact with it. So you can't prove from here that you have to do shmira from an earlier stage. And if you have to do shmira from an earlier stage, he was trying to prove from there, it's clear you have to do latita, because otherwise, why would you be watching it from an earlier stage? Even though they rejected his proof, oh, sorry, I missed the last line, right? Hachanami, likewise here, shlimur delisha havi shimur. You could then say the same thing by us. Maybe shlimur delisha would be enough. So then they say, even though they rejected this proof, afilu hachi lo hadrabe rabba. In this case, it's interesting, right? They're always talking about people changing their minds on this stuff. Even though they disproved him, he still kept with what he said. And not only that, but now we're going to jump to a 4th stage, which is an earlier stage. He's going to say not only when you do the tita, but even before that. Okay, once you harvest it, from that point you have to watch it, and that's what we hold. That's what shmur matzah is. He spoke to the ones who would deal with the bundles of wheat in the fields. When you're doing it there, when you're dealing with them, do it l'shem mitzvah matzah. Okay, when you're harvesting them, have in mind that this is for the mitzvah, meaning at that point you already have to be watching it. Alma kasaver, therefore we hold shimur me'ikara mitchilatova ad sofo be'ina. You need it from the beginning, from the first stage to the last stage. Marbury Ravina, another person who talks about Shmirah, another thing he would do, Menatale Ime, specifically his mother, okay, not him, but his mother would put it ba'arbe. She would put it in either a box or a separate area, okay? It would already be designated from the beginning. This is going to be used for matzah already from the time of the harvesting. Now we're back to chitim getting in contact with water, and is it going to be a problem? So there was a boat of chitim, detava b'chishta. It sunk into the chishta, which Rashi says is the name of a river. Some people say it means something else, but in any case, let's just go with Rashi. It sunk in the river chishta, but it didn't sink entirely. It just kind of started falling in. Someone pulled it out. We have all these chitim now that came in contact with water. So the question is, the concept here is that this was before Pesach. The issue is, what can you do with this? So Sharya Rava Lizabune Linochlim. He said, you can sell it to Gentiles. You can't sell it to Jews. What's the problem? The real problem here is that we have wheat that got wet, but then it dried. But the fact is there might be some liquid absorbed in it and it might be quicker to rise. But no one's going to know that because it doesn't really look very different. Maybe they're a little puffed up, but it's not a noticeable difference. But yet, because they came in contact with liquid, they might actually leaven. So he says, so sell it to Gentiles. Don't sell it to Jews because they might use it on Pesach. We're obviously talking about this was sometime before Pesach, and it's not like if it was in September, it wouldn't be a problem. But don't sell it you can sell it to Gentiles, not to Jews. Rabba Bar Levi Rava. But Rabba Bar Levi questions Rava and says again, right? We see Rava a lot changing his mind today. He questions Rava and he says, Beged she'avad bo kilayim. He takes it from a different scenario. We have shatnez in clothes. We have wool and linen mixed together. But avad bo kilayim, we don't know anymore. Right? Shatnez is the kind of thing we don't really notice. Right? You can't really tell. So we don't know that it doesn't look like it's shatnez. You cannot sell it to a Gentile. And you can't make it a saddle cloth for your a saddle for your donkey, because what will happen? So let's go back to the nochri. Can't sell it to a nochri because what might they do? They might sell it to a Jew. And the Jew won't know that it has kilayim in it, and could be a problem. You also can't use it for a saddle, even though shatnez is only an issue with wearing it. But even if you put it as a saddle, what might happen? You might take some threads from there and use it for your clothes. So you can't do that. This is interesting. First of all, to think about, you're making tachrichim for a mate with shatnez, right? But I guess it's not considered wearing for the dead person. But you can make it for shrouds for a dead person, because what's the issue here? Well, there's no concern that anyone's going to take strings from there and use it in their clothing, because no one's going to do that. Because no one's going to, right? First of all, you can't benefit, I think, from shrouds of a dead person, and it's just not going to happen. So anyway, going back to our issue, what's the reason? Isn't it because we're worried he's going to sell it to a Jew, in which case we're now going to have a problem, right? Because if he sells it to a Jew, right, the Jew won't know. Likewise by us. How can you sell these wheats to a Gentile if he might sell them to a Jew and the Jew won't have any idea? So Hadran, Rava changes his mind. Sell it in small amounts to different Jews. Okay, if you sell a kav, which is not a large measurement, sell a little bit, and that way, that way they'll finish up the wheat before Pesach, and they won't have an issue. Obviously, this kind of depends on how close to Pesach this is. Tanu Rabbanan, ein molelina takdera bepesach. Okay, now we're talking about milila. Milila seems to be this. Okay, if you know when you cook up a soup, like a chicken soup, you get that stuff on the top, the foam, and it's a little disgusting. Or if you cook up hummus, you end up with that foamy stuff at the top. So one of the ways of getting rid of it, right? I always take a spoon and kind of take it off. But apparently in those days, they would get rid of it by putting flour, and the flour would absorb the foam. So can you do this on Pesach? Some people say that we're talking about also cleaning out the pot. I was thinking the way people use baking soda to kind of clean out pots, maybe they also use flour to clean out pots. So, but if you want to do it anyway, because I guess it's important, you don't have any choice. If you put vinegar on top, we talked about vinegar stops it from leavening. So if you put vinegar on top of it, then it's okay. Some people say, why is this an af? Even. You can even put the vinegar and then the flour, What's the issue? Well, the issue is you have a pot full of boiling water. If you put the vinegar in and then the flour, the vinegar will be less potent because it's already become a ta'arovet, right? It's mixed up with the water. So the Yesh Omrim says, even in that scenario, it's okay. So either way, they come up with a way to permit it, either both methods or maybe just one. So first the Gemara says, Man Yesh Omrim, who is this opinion? Who's this opinion match? So Rav Chisda says, Amar Rav Chisda Rabbi Yehuda, must be Rabbi Yehuda's opinion. Ditnan says in the Mishnah, this is in Shabbat. We learned about this. It's about cooking and the difference between a kli rishon and a kli sheni. Remember that? So ha'ilfas b'ktera shediram mirotchim. If you take a pot that was on the flame and you just move it off the flame, we all know that that stays very hot for a very long time. Lo yitain letochan tavlin. You can't put spices directly in there on Shabbat because they're going to be very hot and they're going to cook. But if you put everything in that pot into a different pot that wasn't on the fire, which we call a kli sheni, then you could put the spices in there. Okay, so far this doesn't have anything to do with our topic. Rabbi Yehuda Omer, lakol hu noten, you can even put it in a kli rishon that was on the fire, chutz midavar sheyesh bo chometz v'tzil, unless it has brine or vinegar. What's the issue? If there's vinegar in it, what will it do? It will speed up the cooking. Just like with the flour here, it'll speed up the cooking. Now, speeding up the cooking on Shabbat is a problem. Speeding up the cooking with the flour is good because the more it speeds up the cooking, it won't have time to leaven. What do you see here? We're talking about a pot that had a soup in it or a stew or something with vinegar, where the vinegar was mixed in and yet it still is very potent. So that's why they say this must be Rabbi Yehuda, who says even then it still has its potency. Gemara asks, why didn't you learn it like Rabbi Yossi? Did Tanya Rabbi Yossi Omer, Shoran v'chometz v'chometz somtan. Rabbi Yossi said before that if you put after you did the latita of the solim, right, you rinse them, if you put them in the vinegar, it won't be a problem. So they say, why don't you hold by him? He's the one who says vinegar has this special power. So they say, no, you can't prove it from there because that's a very different situation. That's not a ta'arovet of chametz. That was stick them right into a bowl of vinegar. That's kiyashmina leila Rabbi Yossi, hanimili di'ita be'ene. That's if it's just vinegar, straight vinegar. But he wouldn't necessarily agree that if it was already mixed in, that would be just as potent. So we have our two opinions, whether you have to do it, the vinegar on top of it, or even if the vinegar was mixed in already with the water, would it still have the same potency? Comes Ula, and he says, now this is interesting because usually if there's two Tanaitic opinions, the Amorim have to at least hold by one of them. But in this case, and he clearly says it, he thinks we should be more stringent. Again, this is the issue of how much do we have to be concerned about something turning into something leavening on Pesach. He says better off to take the stringent approach. Ula amar, whether you put the vinegar first or whether the vinegar is mixed in, I don't care. It's all forbidden. Stay away from it. Mishum lech amrina nizira schor chor lekarmelo tikrav. If a Nazir is walking on a path and he walks through a vineyard, they tell him, better off don't walk through the vineyard because you can't eat grapes. And if you walk through that vineyard and see those beautiful grapes, it's going to be very hard to deal with that temptation. So they quote this all the time. It's like a catchphrase for better off staying away from something and not putting yourself in a situation where you might be tempted to do something that's forbidden. Likewise, don't play with fire, right? And that's why are you starting with this? Don't use this to get the foam off, come up with a different solution. Rav Pape Sharile Lebordiki Debe Resh Kaluta Lemimche Kdera Bechasise. He allowed them to use these crushed, roasted, or toasted grains, okay, the toasted grains to basically get rid of, again, it's not exactly clear what they were using it for, maybe also to get rid of the foam at the top of the pots. Now here it was roasted already. So therefore they allowed it. Now notice where they are. Remember in the Beiresh Galuta. So we told the chefs in the Beiresh Galuta's house, you can use this toasted grains to remove the foam. Amarava, Rava says, do we allow this in a place where there's a lot of servants? Servants aren't going to know the difference. I mentioned this in the beginning of Shiur, that maybe we have to distinguish between people. Servants aren't going to know the difference between something that's roasted and something that's not roasted. And maybe they're going to end up doing this with regular flours. So don't start letting them do it in one way. And particularly, it could be he was upset because it was the Reish Galuta's house. If you remember, there's all these issues. In the Reish Galuta's house, they weren't always so careful, all his servants, about doing things. And therefore, maybe that was his problem. Some people say his reaction was different, and it's unclear whether there's actually a real difference in this opinion, or just a different way of saying it, or maybe this means something entirely different. Rava Gufa Machele Kidra Bechasise. He did it personally himself. Now that means either he was trying to show people there's no problem, or in which case this disagrees with the first reading, or maybe it says he did it himself. He didn't want the servants to do it, right? How often do you think Rava was in the kitchen, right? He came into the kitchen, specifically did this himself because he didn't want anyone else doing it, because he didn't want any to people to misunderstand. Obviously, you could see how people can misunderstand. If he does it himself, maybe they'll think we could do it. So it's a little bit tricky here, and it's unclear how to understand. Next Mishnah. This Mishnah has 3 parts. It's a very strange Mishnah because the middle line seems to have absolutely nothing to do with anything. The first 2 lines have to do with chametz. The middle line has to do with that you can't cook the meat of the Korban Pesach. Okay, the forbidden, if you remember, there's a verse in the Torah that says has to be roasted. It can't be cooked. And we're going to talk about, can you cook it in fruit juice? Okay, is that the same as cooking it in water? Is it the same forbidden nature by the Torah? So Safrai claims that the reason this is here is possibly because we were talking about fruit juices in general, about leavening, and maybe because of that, they segued to this, but it's really seemingly out of place. Ein nonim kemach letoch charoset or letoch chardal. Okay, charoset here does not mean what we call charoset. Charoset is some sort of dip. Okay, that's what our charoset is, a dip. It's called charoset, but they called any dips charoset. So you can't put it into a dip. Apparently it had vinegar in it, because vinegar, again, is going to make it leaven. So you can't put flour into that or into mustard. Okay, the idea is that both these have vinegar in them or strong flavors, that maybe the mustard didn't have vinegar, but had strong flavor that's going to cause it to leaven. Ve'im natam, but what if you did? Again, we get to this same question all the time. What if you did it anyway? Ya'achel miyad. According to Tanakama, eat it immediately so that it doesn't come to leaven. Rabbi Meir Oser, he says, no, it's chametz already, can't eat it. Here's our part about the Korban Pesach. You can't cook it not only in water, but in any of the 7 liquids, or even in mei perot. Okay, our 7 famous liquids that, right, blood and milk and all those. I mean, obviously you're not going to do it in milk, but any of the mashkin, and not even in liquid that comes out of fruit juice. Aval, sachinu matbilino tobahem, but you can put some of that on top. You can baste it with those, or dip it into something. That's fine. That's not called cooking it. We're back to chametz issues. When you're baking, often what do? You have, if the dough is very sticky, if you put your hands in a bowl of cold water, it prevents the dough from sticking to your hands. So the bakers obviously had a bowl next to them with water that they would use to basically put their hands in to rinse them off. So now on Pesach, if you have something like that with the flour in it, what are you going to do? If you leave that, you're going to get flour into that bowl. So you have to basically dump it so that it's not in your possession anymore. You have to get rid of it. Okay, because if you leave it around, it will leaven. Gemara starts off, Amarav Kahana, machloket letocha chardal, aber letocha charoset tivrea kol yisaref miyad. We had a machloket. Can you eat it? If it fell into you mixed the kemach and this dip had some flour in it, can you eat it immediately, or do you have to burn it? So they now say only into chardal was in a machloket, but letoch charoset, everyone agrees you have to burn. Why is there a difference? 2 possibilities. Either the charoset was stronger, and therefore, the chardal was stronger, and therefore maybe it would prevent it from leavening better than the other one. One second. Am I saying right? Right. I guess it's the opposite. It would be less potent, so therefore it would be less likely to have it leaven. Right. If it's more strong, it'll actually cause leavening. So, although maybe it's the opposite, I have to check that later. But anyway, he says the only machloket is the toch hardava, the toch charoset. Everyone agrees you have to burn it immediately, right? The point is that the charoset is much more likely to leaven, and therefore you have to burn it immediately. Some people say that the issue is not that at all. It's not that there's a difference which will cause it to leaven. It's that mustard is much more likely you're going to eat it right away, because otherwise the strong flavor dissipates over time. So therefore, it's more likely you're going to eat it right away, and therefore yachal miyad. Whereas the charoset is usually left for a very long time. And therefore, if we let you eat it miyad, maybe you won't, and then maybe it will leaven. So some people say it's not an inherent difference between them. Tanya nami hachi, there's a right to support this reading. Notice everybody says yisaref miyad. Letocha chardal, there's a machloket. Rabbi Meir omer yisaref miyad. Chachamim omrim yechel miyad. So there's a machloket only by chardal, not by the charoset, and that proves this reading. Amar Rav Huna b'reit Rav Yehuda, Amar Rav Nachman, Amar Shmuel, halachat k'divrei chachamim. In fact, we paskin like the rabbis. So it's allowed to eat immediately, but it seems like only the chardal and not the charoset. Okay, we'll end here for today. Again, you can be left with some ideas about people. I like the idea in today's stuff about changing your mind and listening to other people and rethinking and not always being so confident in what you think and what you believe in. With that thought, have a great day, everyone.